Welcome to a special episode of the British Broadcasting Century podcast. Yes, we are leaping ahead from our 1920s timeline, where we are telling the chronological tale of what happened when in the earliest days of British broadcasting, which generally means the BBC, and now and then we leap forward to some later moment of British broadcasting history, and this may be one of the most recent moments we've ever featured. Ask Elvis was a hugely popular feature on Steve Wright's brilliant BBC Radio 2 show, Steve Wright in the Afternoon, The Big Show. But who was Elvis? This episode will meet him.
Oh, that sounds weird and yet strangely appropriate.
And an interview with comedian Mitch Benn, because, well, that's Elvis. He's taking a show to the Edinburgh Festival this year. He's previewing it in non-Edinburgh places throughout June and July, Edinburgh in August, and he joins us for an extended chat this episode on what made that show possible, the delights of the feature, and his own take on British broadcasting history. It's a leap forward from our usual timeline for a couple of reasons. Partly we have this marvellous interview to bring you, and it's timely and topical. But also, I'll tell you a little bit more about the medical reason that has delayed my research a tiny bit here on the British Broadcasting Century. Not for long, though. Another episode or two, and we'll be back in the 1920s. So you can ask me, and you can ask Elvis, here on the British Broadcasting Century.
Hello, this is Paul Carenza calling.
This is London Calling.
Hello, I'm Paul Carenza. Welcome to your favourite podcast on British broadcasting history, a moment-by-moment guide on what happened when in the earliest days of British broadcasting, especially those times before recordings, where notes aren't so plentiful, and try and bring back to life some of those lost stars and iconic moments. But now and then, we like to do a later iconic moment or two. We've had episodes from Johnny Beerling, the first Radio 1 producer and later head of Radio 1, talking about pirate radio and all sorts of things. In fact, we've got more to bring you on Johnny Beerling, which we will do very soon. We've had interviews with Rita Chakrabarti talking about her way into news, with Lee Mack talking about comedy. And this episode, another comedian for you, Mitch Benn, musical comedian, star of Radio 4's The Now Show, but he was elsewhere on the BBC for 10 years. This hugely popular feature on the most popular show on radio, Ask Elvis. You could ask Elvis anything and Elvis would know and would deliver the answer in his own inimitable style, often with a song or a fluency in another language. It was like an audio version of Google, plus hilarity, plus the late great Steve Wright. But at the heart of it was this guy, Mitch Benn. Delighted to welcome to the podcast a man whose identity we can now reveal. This has been, I feel like we've not been able to say for decades. Maybe we could have done. I'll let you do the big reveal because that's nice, isn't it? Mitch Benn, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, well, I mean, my name is Mitch Benn, but among other things, which is the sort of the thrust of my Edinburgh show this year, for about 10, 12 years there, I suspect, or certainly it became apparent, just about the most popular bit on the biggest show in British radio.
I'd agree.
You knew it was me. The thing I used to do on Steve Wright in the Afternoon on Radio 2, which was colossal. I mean, it used to get 7-8 million listeners a day, that thing. It was absolutely colossal, that show. And I used to do a thing called Ask Elvis, which I hasten to point out was not my idea. It's about 2003, so I've been doing the Now Show for about 3 or 4 years by that stage. And of course, one of my jobs on the Now Show was doing funny voices, which is interesting. A lot of people didn't actually get that until, including actually quite a lot of people quite high up in BBC radio comedy, but that's neither here nor there. One of my jobs on that show is actually, and because, people would turn up to the recorders and go, "Oh, I didn't know you do the funny voices." And well, look, there's only us here. You know what I mean? Who do you think? Yeah. And so I used to do a lot of character voices and impressions to... one of the things about the Now Show is it wasn't an impression show. It wasn't Dead Ringers. So I used to like the fact that we sort of did impressions to a slightly different level. We did impressions to a sort of you can tell who it's meant to be sort of level to get the gag to work. But it's not a sort of completely indistinguishable from the real thing, could do prank calls kind of level.
Yeah, it was more of a caricature. I mean, a bit like the voice, which we've not... Yeah, the Ask Elvis thing, which is... It felt like a kind of fun caricature rather than trying to impersonate, necessarily.
Exactly. And so, one of the voices that I used to do on the Now Show, if for whatever reason it came up, was Elvis. Actually, soon recall it came up more in this bit of Bad Week, which is the kind of the sister production to the Now Show that was on in Radio 2 at the time. But anyway, it was a guy called Tom Fenner, who at the time was one of the producers on Steve Wright, got hold of I think it was Adam Bromley, who was the producer of the Now Show at the time, and said, can any of your lot do Elvis? Because they'd had this idea. I don't know where they got the idea from, of just people phoning up with questions about anything, and Elvis answers them. And I mean, literally anything. And then I think they'd asked Rob Brydon, and I think he was already too big a deal. I think they might have asked like a couple of actual Elvis impersonators, but a lot of them don't do the speaking voice, and also a lot of them don't have, my background in stand-up and in improv, which means that I can put the Elvis voice on and then stay in character wherever the conversation goes. Yeah. And so I got asked in to do it, and they just instantly went, "Oh, this is great." But we also decided right at the beginning that we were never going to say who Elvis was, because it just, for the sake of the joke, it kind of made more sense if we never actually owned up to who Elvis was. People would figure it out occasionally. One of my favorite examples of this was Dan Antopolsky has, I don't even know if it's credited, but certainly a non-speaking cameo at the beginning of the Da Vinci Code, playing Jesus in the biblical flashbacks.
Wow. I didn't know that.
That's Dan in a 90. Yes.
Okay. Yes.
So, but every now and again, I would either say something which made it obvious it was me. Apparently, Kathy, my wife's been listening to some of the recordings which are on YouTube of Elvis, and she said, if I laugh, they can tell it's me, because it kind of comes out as my laugh rather than what Elvis is laughing.
Yes. Well, I remember round about then, I was gigging with you on the stand-up circuit, and I think I bumped into you. I might have done a radio thing at some point as well. But I remember bumping into you, and I was that kind of glint in the eye of me basically going, something about alluding to Ask Elvis, and I remember distinctly that even when it was just us two in the room, you still wouldn't fully commit that it was definitely you.
I would never deny it, but I mean, it's just like, I thought, well, if people have figured it out, there's no problem denying it. But we just decided. But anyway, I just remember I was at this party, and Dan Altopolsky came and he went, "Is that you being Elvis on Steve, right?" And I said, "Yes, like you being Jesus in the Da Vinci Code." And he went, "Right, well, I'm secretly Elvis, you're secretly Jesus. Let's call it a draw."
That's hilarious. Plenty more to bring you on Mitch Benn coming up, including all about his show, Asking Elvis. It's on at the Edinburgh Festival throughout August this year. I'll tell you the details now so you have them. The venue is Underbelly at Bristow Square. It's on at 4 p.m, 5th of August to the 31st. So do go and see it if you are able to get to Edinburgh Festival. And if you're not, there are preview dates, and I'll tell you exactly where and when they are at the end of this episode. But they are Droitwich Spa, Chippenham, Harling, not sure where that is, Watford, Manchester, Berkshire, Bedford, and then, of course, Edinburgh. I'll bring you more from Mitch in a moment, but firstly, a very, very quick word on me. I don't like talking about me very much, but the last episodes we had were our 3-part special on the BBC and the general strike for its centenary. Now, I published part 3. I really enjoyed putting that together and putting it out there. And I've had some lovely feedback as well. So if you haven't heard it already, please do go and take a listen to our 3 episodes that relive those 9 days in May of 1926. We look at articles in newspapers, those that were still printing, history books, first-hand witnesses. It was a crazy time when the BBC came into its own, when John Reith literally was editing the Prime Minister's speech as he was delivering it, curating the news in a way that perhaps isn't appropriate for a general manager of a broadcasting company. Churchill tried to commandeer the BBC, and ultimately the Beeb came out stronger. So I clicked publish on that, and I went to bed, and I woke up the next morning, and I couldn't stand up. I was on the floor, and the world was spinning, and long story short, it was a stroke. Yeah, from general strike to specific stroke. Now, I am 47 years old. It doesn't feel classic stroke age, but of course it can strike, so to speak, at any age. Now, first of all, we're saying I'm doing all right. You know, there are still some underlying bits and pieces going on, but some of those classic things people might think of, the face and the speech and the memory, very gladly, the bit of the brain that was affected didn't touch any of that. It was purely balance and coordination. I've never been that coordinated to begin with, to be honest, but balance was very tricky. I had to relearn how to walk. I had a few days where I'd have been like Bambi on ice. But I've had therapy, which has been brilliant, and gladly the brain is very clever and it finds workarounds for those bits of the brain that it can no longer access because of the stroke, which prevent the walking. So I've been building up, walking around the house, walking up the garden, walking down the road. I can't drive for a few weeks, So I've had to cancel gigs, cancel an evening of very old radio in Weston-super-Mare, but I've delayed that. That's now late July. So if you were going to come to Weston, then do look at the Blake Hay Theatre's website. We're now Wednesday, 29th of July. Thank you for your patience if that was what you had in mind. So the stand-up gigs are delayed for a little while, and I'm having basically an enforced month off, although I have been writing because I like to write. It's my hobby as well as my job. Let's go with job. That sounds a lot better, doesn't it? So, yeah, you can't keep that from me, please, because I love it. I love this British Broadcasting History Research project, and I am just so grateful and so glad that it's no worse, that the stroke, thankfully, has left no lasting damage in terms of those cognitive areas. So very grateful for that, very grateful for the support and comments and messages. I've had many of them from this podcast and from worlds of stand-up and radio things I do at today's BBC, and friends and neighbours and soup. I've had lots of soup. It's been marvellous. So thank you so much if that's been you. And if it hasn't been you, thank you in any case for just being here and sticking with us. As a result, I'm a little bit delayed on a few things, which means that our next episode back in the 1920s is going to be on just after the BBC's first anniversary, November 1923, the start of the first relay station. That's in Sheffield. We've got an interview with Andrew Barker, and there's a bit more researchy things to pull together for that. So that'll be with you. It might be next episode. It might be the one after that. It may even be the one after that. So in the next month or two, expect our 1920s Sheffield relay station story to be brought to you on this podcast. In the meantime, some slightly easier editing in terms of this episode and probably the next one as well, bringing you some later insights. And that's why this episode, we bring you the tale of Mitch Benn and Ask Elvis. Although, to be honest, even before I was ill, Mitch did ask if I could put this out about nowish, because he's got previews to do. He's got live shows. The first one is 3rd of June 2026. It's the Rickmail Comedy Festival in Droitwich Spa. So if you're near there, 3rd of June, go and see Asking Elvis from Mitch Benn. And here he is.
One of the weird things about being on the radio is that sort of weird, famous but not thing, you know what I mean? I remember one time I was hanging out with Matt Lucas, and it wasn't long after he and David had won all the comedy awards for like the second season of Little Britain or whatever it was. And he couldn't go like 20 yards, you know what I mean? He was getting in it, but he was being incredibly nice about it. He was like, leaving people answer phone messages in the Vicky Pollard voice and that kind of thing. And I remember actually speaking about this with my manager Ian, who managed Bruce Forsyth for since the 70s, and talking about that. And he said, but he said he's talking about Bruce. He said there's kind of a 3-year cycle if you're lucky enough to last that long. The first year it starts happening, you're made up because this is what you've been working towards for your career. When, excuse me, aren't you him off the telly, blah, blah, blah. Second year is when you can screw it up because that's when it starts to annoy you, right?
Okay.
And you can blow it in the second year by starting to become snarly, you know what I mean? Right. And you can screw it up in year 2 if you start going, naff off and leave me alone, By year 3, if you're lucky enough to last that long, it's just become your life and you've adapted to it. But the weird thing about being on the radio, of course, is that even sometimes if people can be a big fan, they don't necessarily know what you look like. Because, I've done bits of TV, but mainly radio. But also a lot of live stuff as well. One of the weird things is I've got a terrible memory for names and faces. I've got a brilliant memory for some things. It's dreadful for others. And one of them is names and faces. And so it's often quite unnerving for me when somebody will just literally walk up to me and strike up a conversation. And I do not remember who they are. And I'm thinking of, there is actually a good chance I don't know who they are.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
I just forgot. Yes. There is actually a pretty reasonable chance that I've never met this person.
Yeah.
Because the thing is, when you interact with them on the kind of level that you do on the circuit, you're only 12 feet away. You're in the same room. But ultimately, they're still the audience. You're still the performer. You're not necessarily going to have any idea who they are. And were you a properly famous person off the TV, they would know that.
And I guess in your case, you've got a mix then of people who are fans who've they've seen you do stand up physically in the same room, people who've heard you on like the Now Show or It's Been a Bad Week, and they like your radio set, but they don't know what you look like necessarily. And then and the Elvis stuff, who has got this massive audience. And yet people don't know who you are.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, it was like, it just got nuts. I mean, after 2 or 3 years of it, is when Life on Mars was on, and they had John and Phil in the studio because, of course, Steve would get all these celebrities in all the time. So they had John Sim and Phil Glenister in Life on Mars, and they were like, "Oh, we're really disappointed Elvis isn't here." And we've got somebody listening all the time, and when Elvis comes on, we like pause productions, we'd all listen to it, and then we started to get like genuinely famous. I got a call from David Cassidy as in that's David Cassidy, and ended up having a conversation. I can't even remember what the conversation was about. But as soon as part of it was in Spanish. That's the other thing, is I'm a languages graduate. That's what I did at university. And I quite like occasionally surprisingly deploying the languages at moment when people aren't expecting it. And it just adds a little additional dimension.
I recall that because it was this, and it's worth saying as well, for anyone who's not heard it, you've got to find it and listen to it. The Elvis character that you had, which is slightly different to Elvis in real life, I think it's fair to say. He knew everything. This is like Wikipedia meets Elvis, isn't it?
Well, that was part of the joke. I mean, obviously, we were getting the questions in advance. We were looking the answers up. You know what I mean? I don't think it will come as a surprise to anybody.
But the fact you could suddenly break into what seemed to us at home like any language, you are multi-talented Elvis. It's incredible.
Well, that's the idea, that Elvis knows everything. That Elvis is just this all-knowing genius. And it was just really good fun. And because obviously, there are certain kind of sentences which do not necessarily lend themselves to the Elvis voice until you hear it. Being read out in his voice, and suddenly think, oh, that sounds weird, and yet strangely appropriate. It was great fun, and also it had that kind of nice zoo thing that I was in the room with Steve and Tim, is kind of psychic, and they were cracking up sometimes at the callers. They would crack up at the callers, what they were calling in for, like questions about tectonic plates and stuff, and Elvis always knows the answer. You can never catch Elvis out. That's part of the fun. And it just became this weird little phenomenon.
You mentioned about Steve and Tim. I was a guest on one Steve Wright in the Afternoon show. I had a book thing, and they kindly had us on because they're just generous. They're just lovely, warm, generous. Had you on, and I really went in that room. I don't recall being in a radio studio before that had that level of warmth and welcome.
They really were, and Steve had an absolute ironclad instinct for what made that show work. You know what I mean? In many respects, people thought it was all a bit of anachronism because, he had that slight undertone of smashy and niciness right up until the end. But it was just warmth. It was just what he was like. You're right. And he had an absolute love of radio as a medium and an unerring instinct for what was going to make that show work. And of course, he was in there all day because the show was on air from 2 till 5. But he'd get there at 9 a.m. and start pre-recording bits and everything, and he was there for about another hour after they came off air. So he was in there all day. He would basically be tinkering at, because the show was huge. One of the things that I found kind of interesting over the years, being primarily a radio guy rather than anything else, is people's awareness of the whole concept of radio comedy. For example, I spend my life correcting people when they're talking about hitchhikers and they talk about, in the original books. And I'm like, books weren't the first iteration. It was a radio show. Right. It was a radio show. Yeah. The Hitch-hiker started. The books came later, and then you got the TV show. Yeah. Much later on, you got the movie. And I was in a stage version of it about 13 years. There's been another stage version of it just recently, which I didn't get to see, but I was in a stage version of it in 2013 with basically the whole original cast except me.
Right. Wow. Gosh.
I was Zaphod. They couldn't get the. Well, the way that came about is it's put together by a guy called Dirk Maggs, who I've been working with on and off for 25 years. He's a brilliant guy. He's a wonderful guy, Dirk. And kind of, if you're one of Dirk's pals, he'll usually find something for you to do,
In fact, I should say as well, Dirk Maggs listens to this podcast, so he'll be delighted to hear that you've said nice things.
It was early 2013. He'd been commissioned, bizarrely, by Radio 3 to do a series of little comedy playlets about various composers. And the composers were all played by Simon Russell Beale. One time I got to work with him. Right. He's amazing. And we were recording it in Maida Vale, and we were doing these little comedy playlets about composers. And I was just in the rest of the cast, and we got to the end of these, did them all in about 3 or 4 days. We got to the end and said, so what's next, Dirk? And he said, well, I'm taking Hitch-hikers back out. Because he'd already done this the previous year, he'd done it in 2012, reassembled the whole original cast and done it like a live radio show standing on mics. And he said, and I knew that they'd had rotating guest narrators, the book, and I said, well, I can come and be the book at some point if you want. And he said, well, I'll put you on the list. And then I said, and listen, if you ever can't get hold of Mark Wynne-Davey, I entirely base my personality on Zaphod Beeble. And there was this weird moment, and he went, right, are you being cute, or is that an actual suggestion? I said, you haven't got Mark. And he said, no, we can't get him. Because Mark at the time was, I think he still is, a professor of drama at this university in New York. I forget which one. So he could do the previous one because it was across the summer, but he couldn't do the next leg because it was into the autumn. So they went, we haven't got a Zaphod. Ooh, shall we do phone calls? So I ended up taking over for Zaphod for that tour, which is wonderful. But the other weird thing is, it's like the Americans having no concept of radio comedy, which is so weird because for 10, 15, well, maybe nearly 20 years, radio comedy in America is the single most popular broadcasting there's ever been. Right. Things like the Marx Brothers show and the Jack Benny show. These used to literally get 50 or 60 million listeners every week. You know, they were like the most popular broadcasting there's ever been. And then the weird thing is, when TV kicks in properly in sort of the early 50s, it almost immediately completely eradicates radio comedy. Within about 10 years, it seems to eradicate the memory of radio comedy. So that, you know, by the time we get to the 60s and 70s, people have forgotten that there was ever such a thing. And it's weird because it was the most popular live broadcasting there's ever been, was American radio comedy in the 30s.
On this podcast, we go way back to the 20s and the like, and John Henry and Tommy Handley and Itmar and stuff. But before you know it, you get to, I'm sure read that again, I'm sure having a clue, still on the air today, you know, and those people who, the BBC Radio almost single-handedly flying the flag for English-speaking audio comedy for decades.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the last bastion of sort of narrative, or indeed spoken word radio, which is anything other than just traffic reports and political invective. Because one of the things that I used to talk about when I used to do Steve Wright with Tim is the fact that they used to send Tim out to do all the press junkets for the movies, you know, where they basically sit a movie star in a chair in a hotel room and everybody files in and out as they get progressively more and more bored, you know. Woe betide you if you got Harrison Ford after about 3 p.m., you know. Absolutely had it. Anyway, but Tim used to go along with these, and he used to have to fight his way in with these American. I mean, we're only seeing TV people today, you know. It's just like, and he would look at Sky News breezing in and go, "You do know we've got 13 times their audience, right?"
Yeah, wow. It's the thing, isn't it? It's huge.
Fighting if they get 500,000. We get 6 or 7 million every day, you know.
Yeah, totally.
And so, you know, the Americans in particular have like no concert of a show like Steve's. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
I also had a weird fascination with vintage radio comedy as a kid, which is how indirectly I discovered what my current touring show is about, which is Tom Lehrer.
Oh, yeah. So I see. This is the thing. So it's worth saying, we've not really talked much about, but you are in Edinburgh doing the Steve Wright, the Ask Elvis show.
That's what I'm working on right now.
But I've seen you are doing Tom Lehrer as well. So you're doing 2 shows this year, basically.
Well, the Tom Lehrer was last year's show, but I'm currently touring it. So the sort of the weird bit is going to come when I'm still touring Lehrer and starting to preview Elvis.
Right.
Because that's when they'll overlap, you know. So that will be sort of June and July. I will still be doing tour shows for Lehrer and then previewing Elvis. And I've actually got some tour shows for Lehrer after the summer into the autumn as well, because if I tour Elvis, it'll probably be the beginning of next year, you know. Right. It used to be the way it works. We kind of see how a show does at Edinburgh before we decide whether to take it on the road. You know?
Yeah,
And
brilliant.
the Lehrer show actually went gangbusters, at least partly because he died 3 days before we opened.
Oh, really?
Which I've got to say, you know, at the risk of being utterly cynical, did not do us any harm whatsoever. You know,
well,
I mean,
of course, that's not the case of Elvis, of course, because Elvis is still alive and works in a fish and chip shop.
Well, funnily enough, that was kind of the conclusion I came to when I did a radio show back in 2013 called Mitch Benn is the 37th Beatle. Because we have all kinds of weird connections to the Beatles. I grew up in Liverpool in the 70s, in the sort of the debris of Beatlemania. My parents, and particularly my mum, actually knew a bunch of them growing up. And, you know, she was briefly going out with one of the other guys in the Quarrymen in the 50s and everything. So my mum knew him, you know. My dad was kind of aware of them, although he was a bit older than him. And so I've got all these kind of weird little connections to the Beatles. So I did this show called Mitch Benn is the 37th Beatle, about all the people who've ever been called the 5th Beatle and trying to get them into some kind of order, you know. And that went over pretty well in Edinburgh. So I did it. At the time, I was still doing the Now Show and everything. So I did a cut-down version of it for the half-6 BBC Radio 4 slot, which was difficult, but I managed to get it down to like 28 minutes. So that show exists in 3 different lengths. Okay. It's like its Edinburgh length, which is an hour, the touring length, which is 2 hours and 45, and then the radio length is cut all the way down to 28, which is difficult, but we did it. And then on the back of that, they went, this is great, can we do 3 more of these? So the next year I did an Elvis one, a David Bowie one, and a Bob Dylan one. And that was actually just 6 months before David Bowie died. So we at the time didn't know he was on his way out at the time. And the Elvis one actually comes to the conclusion that, you know, Elvis is still alive. And this is another important thing that we always made sure we never did on Ask Elvis. Never use the name Presley, only ever called him Elvis. Because I like to make a distinction between Elvis and Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley was a real guy, you know, was born into blood, died in 1977, you know. That was a real guy. And he's dead, all right? He's gone. But he created this thing called Elvis, which has outlived him on so many different levels. And so I regarded what I was doing on air radio as part of that. So I was perfectly happy for this thing I was being on the radio to be referred to as Elvis. I said, let's never call him Elvis Presley. You know what I mean?
Great.
So that was a real guy. And so that was kind of the conclusion I came to in my Elvis special on the radio, is that Elvis, one word Elvis, has become this thing, this character of him, like that he created, that will outlast him, and it is outliving him. He is being continually reportrayed and reincarnated by various people at varying levels of seriousness. Will be for the foreseeable future. But Elvis Presley, he died age 42.
Elvis lives. The fact it's an anagram as well, that helps, doesn't it?
Yeah, the fact that it's an anagram of lives, it's all just, exactly it all seems like fated. Yeah. But yeah, so basically Elvis, Elvis continues, but Elvis Presley is gone, and that's
the Edinburgh show itself. Then I know these things are still written in the process, but what's the plan for the show?
Well, the plan of what I need to do. This is basically the approach I've always taken to Edinburgh shows, because I'm just trying to think of how many different Edinburgh, specifically themed Edinburgh shows, as in solo shows. What it comes down to a lot of the time is, what do I know enough about and care enough about and have enough to say about that I can basically wang on about it for an hour?
I do exactly the same. That's my approach as well, which is partly how I've ended up with this podcast.
And hopefully in an engaging and perhaps even entertaining way. So what I'm doing at the moment is I'm hammering out the through line. What's the narrative? Is there a thought that progresses through this hour and arrives at some kind of place? How does the thought evolve? Because also, once you've got that down, it makes the whole thing so much easier to learn, because everything's a kind of a thematic progression from the last bit. There is actually a flow. There's a kind of a narrative flow. And once you've got that, also in particular, I can look at that as almost like see where the bends in the river are, and that's where the song's needing. I can see that. And then it's a question of, do I perhaps have any of these songs already? And obviously I've written a whole bunch. I've got a whole album of Elvis-ish songs on my Bandcamp site, and because I've written a lot of them over the years. So I kind of treat Edinburgh shows as like albums, in as much as the songs don't necessarily have to have been written specifically for that show, but if at all possible, they should not have been in a previous Edinburgh show. Mm-hmm. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
They should not have been in a previous Edinburgh show, touring show. Now, I wrote a song called "What Would Elvis Do?", which would actually work very well as an opener for the show, but I've yet to decide whether I will or not. I might write a whole new opener for it, or I might go with that. I don't know. The other thing about Ask Elvis was I was actually thinking about trying to resurrect it as a podcast. It's 10 years now since I think Steve got me back in to do a one-off when he knew the show was getting cancelled.
Right.
So that was about 3 or 4 years ago. We went back in to do a one-off.
That's lovely.
But I was thinking so I was trying to get hold of Wright, just to try and get his blessing on it when the news came that he died.
Right. Wow.
Which came as a bit of a shock to him. But weirdly, that was actually almost belatedly, we realized kind of the upside to the show getting cancelled was that he'd already had the outpouring of affection. It always kind of breaks your heart when somebody dies and there's an outpouring of affection for them, and you find yourself thinking, you couldn't have said that while they were still here.
Yeah.
They probably would have hidden all this while they were still here.
That's true. And we did with Steve. Yeah, that's true.
With Steve, we did, because there had already been the outpouring of affection from about 2 years previously when the show got canned. I was very sad that he went, because, he was a remarkable guy to work with. And of course, the other weird thing is, he's like so many of those DJs, he was a constant on my life, because one of the weirdest things about doing Ask Elvis was Steve's show on Radio 2 in the noughties was pretty much exactly the show he'd had in the 80s and 90s on Radio 1 when I was a student. Except instead of Phil Cornwell being Mick Jagger, it was me being Elvis.
Right, okay, yes. That's fair enough. Things change.
It still was the same show,
Things change very slowly.
Yeah, but also that was the other thing with Steve, it's to Steve's credit, is he had the self-awareness to know, okay, time I move this thing over to 2, because my audience are not the kids anymore. But what it meant was the show itself, although it hopped networks, actually ran for, what was it? Must have been 25, 30 years?
It's about that, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, because, essentially just by hopping it over to the slightly more grown-up network, but other than that, leaving the format more or less intact, it was amazing. I literally remember listening to that, when I was doing my O levels, in the 80s. And
totally.
30 years later, I'm on it. It's weird.
I know for many people were saying they've literally, it's just been their entire adult life and childhood sometimes has been listening.
Because the other thing about radio, people's voices tend to stay the same, even if they change. So that was what because when I remember when Wogan went back to do the breakfast show again, like he was when I was being got ready for primary school. Like the mid-70s, and suddenly Wogan was doing the breakfast show again, and there was that sound again. It's like, oh my god, I feel like I should be putting on short grey trousers and eating red.
It is, isn't it? Yeah. And that was, I think he did a total of over 25 years or something with a several year gap. So it's a generation, completely a generation, really. Yeah, it's incredible.
So we used to Ask Elvis Inn has been renamed Wogan House. It used to be called Western House, and it's now called Wogan House. So, yes.
And even that's now sold as well. So now it's different
Probably.
times now. Different times.
Yeah.
So is there a risk with the Ask Elvis Edinburgh show that audience members might heckle a question to which you haven't had a chance to prepare?
We are trying to set up a mechanism by which people can submit questions, which hopefully will give this. If you go to mitchbenn.com, there's an Ask Elvis button in the top menu, if you like, which will lead you to a link where you can submit questions, whether you're coming to see the show or not. That hopefully will give me time to do a bit of research. If people heckle, I don't know. My knowledge of trivia is extensive. It's not. I mean, I did win Celebrity Mastermind in 2016.
Well,
I should point that.
I think you do all right. I think you do all right.
I should put that. I mean, I'll do about as well as as anywhere. Probably not as well as Paul Sinner would, but
Okay.
I mean, probably
That's
not
true.
as. I don't think I think my Elvis voice is better than his. But
I think you're definitely right there. You're definitely
Paul,
right.
I think you could literally just pluck facts out of the air and throw them at him, and he'd know them instantly.
That's true. They're very good. So what do we need to know about? When's the show? Where's the show? How do people find out more?
When we got some significant previews going up. The first preview will actually be in Droitwich in the first week of June, because I am quite heavily involved again, as I was last year, with the Rick Mail Comedy Festival, which happens in Spa in the first week of June. And in particular, I think the very first preview, it will be rough as all get out. I should point out right now.
Excellent. That's always the best time to see a show.
Wednesday, 3rd of June is the very first preview for it, and that's at that's the Rick Mail Festival in Droitwich. Then other previews I've got Chippenham Fringe at the 28th of June, the Watford Fringe on the 11th of July, the Anthony Burgess Centre in Manchester on the 17th of July. Then I've got the last two, got the West Berkshire Festival on the 24th of July, and then the Bedford Fringe on the 25th, and then basically a few days later we're off to Edinburgh.
Well, those I did those two last year, West Berkshire and Bed Fringe, and lovely fringe festivals. Go and see fringe festivals. Go and see Ask Elvis, everybody. There you go.
Go to mitchbenn.com. Mitchbenn.com's got all the details. It's got many about Lair Effect, about the Elvis show and everything.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for your service, delivering us Elvis.
That's very nice you'll say so. Thank you very much.
That's what we need. We need that. Thank you very much. Wonderful. Well, I will just say thank you very much in the voice of me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So that was Mitch Benn. What a wonderful person to chat to. I worked with Mitch both on the comedy circuit and also writing for The Now Show, although Mitch would go off and write his own songs. I would write some bits for Steve Punt and Hugh Dennis and topical bits and pieces. But I've worked with Mitch on and off, and I had my suspicions about him being Elvis. And now he's telling people, because, of course, so sadly, Steve Wright is no longer with us. But we both worked with Steve. I was on Steve Wright in the afternoon once as a guest. I'll put a link to that in the show notes if you like. And also a link, of course, to the tickets for Asking Elvis, which is Mitch Benn's show. Do go and see it. Edinburgh Festival this August. And before then, 3rd of June, Droitwich Spa. 28th of June, Chippenham Festival. 10th of July, Harling Fringe. 11th of July, Watford Fringe. And also the 15th of July there as well. 17th July, Greater Manchester Fringe. You've got the West Berkshire Comedy Fringe on the 24th of July. Just two more. Bedford Fringe, 25th of July. Oh, and then Edinburgh on the 5th to the 31st of August. Highly recommended. Mitch is a lovely fella. Thank you, Mitch, for joining us. Wishing the show well. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So that's Asking Elvis, and as I said earlier, I'm a little bit delayed on some of the research things, but that's partly because of rest and therapy and all of those things, but the headline note is post-stroke, I'm doing all right. There are some underlying bits and pieces and tests and follow-ups, but it could have been so much worse. So I am very grateful and glad to be here, and glad to be able to bring you another episode of the British Broadcasting Century, which I will do next time. Not quite sure if it will be a 1920s tale of the first relay station in Sheffield. It may be about another live event you can go and see, the Archers Live at 75, hosted by Angela Barnes. She may be joining us. Or indeed, it could be Professor John Wyver talking about his early television conference that he is running. I'll tell you what, I'll put links to both of those in the show notes. So if you're interested in early television and that conference, or the Archers celebration, or indeed Asking Elvis, or so many other bits and pieces to do with this podcast and our research project here, do check out our show notes. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for staying with us, and I'm very glad to be here. The British Broadcasting Century is presented and produced by Paul Carenza. Original music is by Will Farmer. Do find us on Facebook, look for the British Broadcasting Century group. Find us on Blue Sky, BB Century. And you can find Paul Carenza on Instagram and join his mailing list, where he'll tell you more about live shows, including an evening of very old radio, coming to Weston-super-Mare late July 2026. And of course, there's always patreon.com/Paul Carenza to help support this podcast for £5 a month, and you get readings, writings, and videos as well. Stay informed, educated, entertained, and well, please. And join us next time here on the British Broadcasting Century.
Thank you very much.